we will today be covering one of our design lessons, so an extension of the first design lesson on open worlds and interactive narratives. We will go ahead and get started, and I'll show you where you can find the materials for this lesson. So on alice.org, again, if you're just coming to this one, all of the things that we cover in these workshops can be found under the resources section, Alice 3 and lessons. We have covered a bunch of them in here in previous videos, so be sure to go check those out. This section down here called the design process has 3 different lessons with it. The first one we covered was design process introduction. We are going to be leaning on some things that we covered in that. So if you're watching this video and you haven't checked that one out, you may want to go back and watch that one first. We will be covering this middle lesson right now. So if you come into design process interactive narrative, you'll see the materials here, and we are going to jump into the presentation Google Slides. This lesson is offered now in our series just because it leans heavily on being able to use some conditional programming and some event-based programming in order to actually create these worlds. So those are also what we consider some prerequisite lessons just in terms of having the Alice skills needed to build some of the things we're going to talk about today. So going to go ahead and jump in here and talk about designing an interactive narrative. So step 1 is, where do we start? So in the first design lesson, we talked a lot about this design thinking and problem solving process, wherein first you define the problem, then you work to understand the problem, then you design a plan for how to implement that, and then implement the design, test your design, and essentially then go back and iterate as needed until completed. So when we talk about an interactive narrative, we're going to focus on these 2 different types of problems. So our first design lesson was much more in the animation vein. So it was, I want to create a story where something happens. In this one, we're going to add to that, I want to build a world where something happens, because it could be, not necessarily just a story. It could be a environment to experience or just a place to be. So then what tools do we need to help us understand the problem where we're trying to answer that question? Where we've said that, I want to create a world where the user can walk around and interact with animals or something like that. How do I break that problem down, and what are the things to consider when talking about it? For the story, the first block that we covered in the last lesson, for the linear animation, we talked about using scripts and storyboards, some flow charts, and essentially just sort of thinking about, how does our story progress? How do we visualize that story? When we talk about an interactive narrative, we're going to start talking about tools for, how do you map out a branching narrative, or how do you design for an open world? So it might still use some of those tools and should use some of those same tools, but we might add in other elements like a higher level flow chart that is not necessarily around the implementation, but in the planning of our story. The world map, so the scene design that we talked about in a straightforward animation may need to be fleshed out a little bit more, and think about some other ideas when we talk about it. First, let's rewind and just talk about what is an interactive narrative. So an interactive narrative is a story that allows the user to engage the story, participate in interactions, and ultimately change the outcome of the narrative. So the big difference being is that when we talk about sort of a linear animation or something like that, anytime I experience that program, it will most likely follow the same path through. In the things we're going to talk about today, the idea is, much like a choose your own adventure, there are ways that my input as a user can change the way that we advance through that. Or if we're talking about just sort of a completely nonlinear story, I explore it and then the story comes out as I walk around in the world. So if you haven't done a choose your own adventure sort of book from back in the day, or online variation of, there's a bunch of sort of online tools for creating those types of things. It's really just the reader is confronted with a decision, and based on that, we either point them to or jump them to a different point in the story. So there's a couple of different approaches to how we can think about designing or understanding the problem for that. That top diagram is a map branching narrative. And so it's really saying, think about each of the components of your story. All right, so when we talk about that, we're talking about that branching narrative diagram in the top. So, we all start at the beginning of the story. Potentially we move on to different story elements as we progress. Maybe some decision takes us down one other one. In a lot of different stories, you may have it so you can take different paths out, but we bring all of the readers or experiencers back to some key story element, and then we allow them to branch out. In this one, we're showing that there's sort of two different endings to the story. So you could have any number of different endings based on how the user progresses through the story. So this is a way to just think about, key plot points, map them out, see where you might want to have separate plot points that depend on user input, and then bring them back or navigate them to an end of the story. The bottom one is the sort of same level design sketch that we looked at before. And the idea there is that we're not talking about the story in any linear capacity. We're talking about it in terms of thinking about the world that the story takes place in, and then what are the different types of things that might happen throughout that space. And then in a broader sense, you would think about how all of that leads to some understanding of a story or just an experience. So mapping out the stories. A couple of options for how to brainstorm this. And so we sort of talked about that plot mapping. And again, each of those nodes then becoming some plot point in your story. The bottom one saying to think more about the environment and what it means to live in it. The story map, sort of reiterating points I already went through. Chapter event, interactive plot points. So if you first write a script for your story, or you decide you want to do a storyboard, each one of these you could think of as sort of a discrete scene. If it's a storyboard, maybe it's a couple elements, single interaction, longer story interactions. They don't all have to branch. So in cases, this could just go from here to here, but you're still breaking it down by, a scene or a story element. The world map, this one is, once you sort of lay out your world, instead of, thinking about these as those narrative plot elements, you think about them as plot elements as a location. So maybe you start marking up and drawing circles around, this will be interaction 1 or 2, or however you want to label them, and just start thinking about what would happen in this place that would inform the broader story. Another thing that you can do is you can create each of these elements if you want them to have a certain order of engagement, and think about how you might gate the event so that only once they've experienced some other plot point does a character appear here or something like that. So we might have an interaction over here where we talk to somebody and they tell us to go talk to another character or find us an object. Only when we complete that interaction does the character appear here, or does the object become available, and things like that. So even though it is an open world and not necessarily linear, you can create some gated moments where things don't become available until they've interacted with things that you want, seemingly open to them to do whatever they want, but you are still gating some of the opportunities and areas of the world and things like that. That is not to say that our whole first design element and lesson is to be ignored, because each of these is just giving you a broader sense of how you're constructing your world or the longer story that you want to tell. Each of these points should still be broken down into some point of a script or a storyboard, so that, while we've created this whole world map, if we have an element that is right here, we still need to be able to step out and say, well, what do we want the user to experience when they interact with that character, when they interact with that object, when they enter that space? And you're going to want to do a little bit deeper designing so that you can think about what that means in terms of the story. Again, optionally, you can either use a script or a storyboard to do that. Similarly, on the branching narrative, think that each one of these plot point nodes should be sussed out and delve deeper into to create an understanding of what it is you're going to try and compose there. All right, so if we've created that either world map or branching narrative, we've further broken that down into some scripts and storyboards. We really then have, the master plan for what we're trying to do. with our story and understanding our story or our world. But we still need to then translate that into designing a plan for how to do it. Same things apply from our first design lesson. Since we are going to do the scene building and then we are going to do the programming, we still need to think about them in those two different things of like, what is the set design that we need to support it? And then how do we start to do an algorithm or a flow chart in order to think about how we're going to break up our program and program our interactive world. So scene design, same things from our previous one. Each of those plot points or those local areas of the map, we're going to have scripts and storyboards to inform it. So we're still trying to do the whole, if it's a noun or it's a character in the set design or it's something in our world map, that means that we need to have it exist in our scene. The next element that we may have not thought about as much in our animation, unless we did do some multiple locations and having the person transported or animated to another scene or things like that, is that it's going to be much more important to think about how the user moves through the world in either of these elements. That's not to say that a whole interactive story couldn't happen standing in one place. I mean, there's lots of great examples of that, whether it be just a branching narrative, conversation where we're going to program the whole thing where we're just standing in a space interacting with another character. This whole world map could be just objects around me or characters that come and go and things like that. But in the event that we do have multiple there and they have some agency in terms of choosing where they're going to go, you're going to want to start to map out, how are they going to move through the space? When they're standing in spaces, what are they going to see and things like that. So your scene design might take on a little bit more of elements. Perhaps this door doesn't open, and so we're going to call those things out, and it's going to help us understand the flow through the space. For an open world, when we talk about how you do this in Alice, another thing to consider is, are we going to be the character, or is it going to be a third person character? We talked about this in sort of the lesson on event programming. But so here's the one way that you can set up that open world navigation if you're not going to put the player on rails in a branching narrative, and that is to say, we're going to have an object move based on the key inputs, or we're going to have the camera follow another object, or the camera itself is going to be the eyes of the user. So when you're thinking about, what does my story entail? Am I the person that is the main character? In which case, first person camera. So we're going to allow them to move and manipulate the camera as they move through the world. Or are we telling a story and we're watching a story, in which case you'll want to vehicle the camera to the main character or the main mode of transportation and have that be moved around the space. All right, so then how do we translate that we have created? Reiterating again the first lesson, because these are important things and just as relevant here and in our future lessons on design, is that we are going to go back to creating an algorithm design for our program. So what is an algorithm? It's just this set of steps to accomplish the task. So we talked about linear ones where, here is the joke from our first lesson where it just says do an order, the scientist is going to do this, the lightning's going to flash, all of those types of things. When we start talking about an interactive narrative, instead of just being nouns and verbs where there's going to be the object to move and the verb in terms of, how you need to use procedures or something like that to then animate it and move it in the space, we might start seeing sort of these conditional words like if or when and things like that when we start describing our world. So, if the hero responds yes, the Sphinx says you are correct, and there could be a bunch of outcomes from that. Or when the character selects the orb, the user is transported to the moon. These might be things that appear in our script. They could be things in our storyboard where we have arrows going out, or if we chose to use some other things. So start to look for those, and those might be the places where that might be a break in our plot point. That could be a break in our narrative. That could be a conditional in terms of ordering of availability of things in our world map. So we're sort of adding that next layer of how we break down our design phase into thinking about how we're going to program it, and those translating into other ones. So again, same thing, deconstructing these sections. So whereas this might have gone to a script or a storyboard, this one might as well. Another option is then to either do that algorithm design where it sort of calls out the the text version, or flowcharts can be very beneficial in terms of these as well. So choose your own adventure scripted one. It might be a custom procedure for each plot point. So here, conditionals may play a bigger part. So in this one, there's a loop, but maybe there's two different outcomes where we have, something here where we would go this direction in the story or this direction in the story. And you'll be able to visualize that if you use a flow chart for the different outcomes and what they might impact. So yeah, scripted algorithm design. You can also end up with a whole bunch of mixtures of those. As we said, a plot point doesn't necessarily have to be something that diverges. It can just be something that you experience. So since it's really just about telling the story, maybe some of the interactions in my open world are really just things that I interact with. But once I kick them off, they are more of just a script, where it's just I am watching something happen, or I'm getting information from a character, or I'm looking at an object, in which case a script might be the easiest way to do it. Other ones, it might have things where there are conditionals. So while this is true, every time I come up to that, something will happen. But if I come up to it and something has changed, or I have done something else. So really, we're getting to a place where using a mixture of these tools is going to make it a lot easier. And some might be more obvious use cases for just a linear algorithm versus a conditional flowchart. Now that we have sort of that design plan, so we have a mixture of flowcharts and algorithm designs, or just one larger document of that, we're going to go into implementing it. So talking about some things that are some just common things that you might want to use when creating either of these elements. We do have those functions, and we talked a little bit about that in the functions lesson. So you might want to revisit that. From now, this side is the get boolean from user, string from user, things like that. This can be a really great conditional block for a choose your own adventure or some type of branching narrative that says, if one character asks me a question, it could be a true or false question. In that case, in this example on the top right, if I say true, then it's going to take me somewhere else in the story. So essentially this is as generic as it gets, but the gopher is asking me, do I want to go on an adventure? At that point, I say yes, and then we continue on our branching narrative quest. If I say no, it's a very short story, and we go to the end. Another option is using mouse click and things like that interactions. So this might be more relevant for sort of open worlds, where I run around in the world and I use a mouse click to choose it. But in this case, this is another one that you could use for a branching narrative that says, I could be talking to a character and they could present me with, a orb or a feather or something like that and say, which of these objects do you want? And that could lead me to different interactions. In this case, it is basically another example of the, do I want to go on an adventure? But it could have been, click on the banana to find out more, or click on the cake to go home, or something like that. And you see that it then sends you to another interaction or another plot point in my story. For the open worlds, some things that you might want to revisit is the lesson on collision and proximity events. So obviously in that case, a lot of the times you're going to want things to happen when I walk up to an object. So you can either create, a buffalo that I run into in the first one, and then that will actually start something. Proximity is, I get close enough to something and then it will happen. And then the last one is the view entered, which says that, I could be running around in the world, and at the point that I actually, the camera takes in the view of Loki, then something will happen. So these are a lot of the things that you'll want to use if you're just creating an open world where I am allowed to run around however I would like. And at the point that I interact with an object, I'm given more of the story, or part of the world is revealed to me and starts to build that sort of richer narrative. Same thing, testing. So we've talked about this in the problem statement, understand the problem, just reminding that, we've done one full pass. You could do this whole thing on just one plot point or one world event or things like that, and go back and add more. It doesn't have to be the understanding everything at one time, designing everything and implementing it. You can go through, test, and then continue back around. There is something to be thought about in terms of when you're trying to test bigger, broader interactive worlds, that you can use this disabling and fast forwarding. Fast forwarding works a lot better when we have a linear animation, because it's going to jump me to the part of that animation that I want to see if it's working correctly. In this one, since we'll potentially have gated points, or it's going to require user input, those are a little bit more difficult to use, though it will sort of speed up some sections. Another thing to definitely consider when you're doing this is that disabling code to make it so that I can run around the world faster or things like that, or just focus on one element. Remember that since we're having things that might be building on each other, the world might not work in that way. And so that you might be testing code that depended on them having had some other interaction. And so it's not really a valid test if you haven't gone and done the other things that were being expected. That is the general design process. So the things that we have added this week are just the idea of a branching narrative sort of map in terms of laying out your plot points, how they might go through that story in a different order. The idea of really expanding on that world design map and adding locations of interaction, conditional locations of interaction, and then really just starting to create more of a design document that has smaller elements that are within the greater story. So potentially you have a larger script storyboard or story arc map, and then you potentially have call outs to smaller design elements that call out each of those elements where you can work through those. I'm going to show a couple examples. This one, I don't have drafted up the design process tutorial with an example world. So we are working on that, and soon this page will have one that really just walks you through that same exact iterative process that the first design lesson did, with just an example of showing you what the documentation you should be creating before moving on to the next step looks like. So we will create one of those. If you go back to the page itself, and we have some grad students for the summer working on some more luxurious examples, but this is a really good resource for just looking at what the code might look like when you're creating a branching narrative. And I tried to create an example of each type of element you might create. So I'll wait for this to load, and we'll just sort of walk through it. I have commented the code as much as possible. So this one, lets you know that you can click on the first interaction to open up the custom procedure. This is just saying the way to navigate this code, and I tried to make it as abstracted as possible in terms of each interaction or plot point having its own custom procedure. So you'll see those listed here under the scene. As a reminder, you can also right-click on them to look at the inside of it. So the My First method calls this first interaction. If I go to that, we've commented out what it would be. So in this case, it's an example of using a get Boolean as a way to advance the narrative. So you'll see here's some very simple code. Here's the using this in a conditional to advance the story, which then gives the option to go to these two different ones. So again, you can continue down the story arc by following whichever path and looking at the procedure. This would then be the second interaction, and is an example of using a get string from user. So the answer would be containing this, and again, continues on. If they go to the end, there is this other one. So you'll be able to navigate, read the commenting. It should tell you how to navigate more of it. I will show the setup scene because this is sort of an interesting way to look at it. The world map design that we would have for this would have the multiple locations of the story. So in this case, you can see that I've sort of set them all up in a wheel around the starting position. And the way that this code works then is that, we start here, we're looking at this gopher. Depending on the outcome of my interaction with that, it will then either transport me to one of these other camera locations and start the next interaction, which will then be in front of it. So this is just an example of, how do you create multiple elements with different characters to interact with inside the same scene, so that whenever I'm doing any given interaction, I can't see all these other things to come. And in this case, we've been able to add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different locations and interactions within the same world so that we can jump to those depending on how we interact with them. I am going to go back to the starting camera. So here's our gopher. And let's just run through this and I'll talk a little bit about what it might mean. So this is a get Boolean conditional statement to branch the narrative. So it pops up and it says, would you like to go on an adventure? I'm going to say that I would like to go on the adventure. So true. It then transports me down the branching narrative to the next plot point. In this case, it's a get string from user as another branching one. So again, my story could be obviously much more rich, and we hope to put up some examples of how to use these types of branching plot points a little bit more naturally inside something far more creative. But here we go with, do you still want to continue? I do want to continue. So in this case, it's yes. We've used a get string from user, and we've said, does it contain Y? So if I wrote yes, it would still work. We're just looking for the Y. It continues us to the next interaction. So imagining that, we're going to some place, some things happen. In this case, we're showing that the interaction actually contains a, animation. So it could really be as deep as you wanted. Going back to each of these elements could have a storyboard or a flow chart. I could stay in this space and plot point, have lots of things happen, present them with something. So in this case, imagining that I have some interaction with somebody, they show me something, they give me some clues, they do something where, now I have to answer how many times did the bear jump? And if I get it right, or if I learned what I needed to, it might take me somewhere else. If my interpretation was something else from what I learned, in this case, the bear jumped twice. So I'm going to click 2. It then moves to the next camera location for my next plot point. This one is using a mouse click to advance the story. So we have the cake and the banana. The camel had asked me something about, do I want to continue, essentially, another one of these. If I click the banana, we continue, the cake would have taken me home. Again, it could have been a far more interesting narrative moment. This one is telling me that now that we have gotten to this place, a C key and another key will have different inputs. So this is an example of, I can set up events, so key press events, that will impact and take me to some part of the world. If the user doesn't know about them, they're not going to press those keys because they wouldn't know that that's even a possibility in the story. So same as those mouse clicks being available for the banana and the cake, if they're not visible to the player, they can't click on them and advance the story. So you can use some of those things where you don't even need to use variables or set it up so that it can only happen at a certain point. You can just hide those objects or make it not known to the player that these things would make a choice in the story. In this case, I will hit C. So all interactions were completed. So again, the outcome of this one is I have sort of navigated multiple different places where at any point in that story, if I had chosen a different path, we could have moved the camera somewhere else. I will do it one more time to just show you that it is actually functionally giving me a choice. Do I want to go on an adventure? True, false. If I hit false, it takes us to a different location and a different plot point in the story, which would be the end. So look at this world and sort of just take in some of those things. We're going to add up some design documents of what those would look like as a branching narrative. So the narrative map would have, in this case, really just the first plot point with 2 possible outcomes. One of those would advance with 2 outcomes. Then at each one, there would be sort of a line going off to the end, or went home, or gave up, or something like that. But I really just wanted to show the different types of things that you already know how to do in Alice, the types of interactions, the conditionals you know how to build with sort of the events that we've taught you, and some of the built-in functions. And so that can be your sort of toolkit to think about the types of interactions to build in as plot points. Then I'm going to jump back. The next one is going to be an example of an open world. So again, you can grab this example file. In this case, we will see again, comment it out as much as I can so that you will be able to navigate the codes that's in here. And we are working on sort of the design document that would be the example of how we would have done the pre-production on this one, or like what I had done sort of scribbled on paper when thinking about how to show the different types of interactions. Since this one is an open world example where I can move around and do whatever I would like, the majority of the code lives in the initialize event listener. So again, if you're not following what you're looking at here, go back and watch the introduction to events video and take a look at that lesson. And then again, in here, we use a lot of the conditional one, which you should definitely watch if you were doing a branching narrative. And we do a bunch with the collision proximity one. So take a look at that lesson for just how to construct these things. But the first thing we have is the add object move for. We have set up a cylinder. This is an outdated one. We fixed some things where we made the camera an object. So, but imagine that this one actually just has us moving the camera. We were using a cylinder for a collision. This collision detection will trigger when you run into the bison. And again, we have set this up to use creating custom procedures. If you haven't done that lesson, highly recommend it because it just makes this a lot easier to read. If you haven't, you could have all of the code that you wanted to happen for that interaction inside this event. To show you this one, the buffalo collision. So here's all the code and the animation that's going to happen when I bump into the buffalo. So thinking about that one, each one of these has a different outcome that would sort of advance the narrative. And so you'll see the different outcomes. I'm going to go ahead and this one, the world map view, did these as just a moving forward. So again, it doesn't really give you the same thing that in that last one where we created multiple scenes that the user could see only when they moved and turned to things. We did do a little bit of it. As we go through the example, you'll understand why I put that disk there. But we've sort of advanced the storyline as you move forward through the world. Again, having some grad students create much more creative versions of this. So if we run the world, whoa, the buffalo says, come over here and see me. So again, we've got the arrow keys set up. Walk up. Let me restart this. I accidentally triggered something else. So I come up, arrow key. When I get close enough to the buffalo, we run into it. I have to actually move you back when it happens. So talking about how that collision could have had those animals do a whole bunch of other things. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go back to our code. We need to change some of these durations. That is far too fast. Well, I'll just talk you through it. I'll change that one later. All right. So we come up. One collision is to run into the buffalo. So maybe there's something in my world when I run into it. We could have a whole scene animate. We talked a little bit about the design of you want to make sure that the user is somewhere where they can see what is happening when they trigger it, because if you have these things happen, they happen off to the side. And remember that you might want to have them trigger each time, just because what if I didn't catch what that was? In this case, because it's moving too fast. I don't know what just happened there. All right, let's try this again and see if we can make the whole world not disappear. All right, so this one is the proximity. So essentially, this would be hidden to the user, but you see the large white sphere, and that's the distance that I set from the elephant for the proximity to start. So again, it could be something where you create an area of interest in your big world, but I only want it to happen when I am actually close enough to see what happens. So I crossed onto the disk on the ground, and the elephant came alive. Again, now the elephant is explaining why we put that there, but we didn't want to. In this case, we're going to use the look at. So another world could be, I find Freya. She tells me that I want you to look over to the left. So it's sort of a prompt. Now, when I looked over, this is the when in view. So Loki wouldn't have been there to be seen before. Again, we had talked a little bit about the wanting things to happen each time. So that's one where it could just be as soon as I see an object, it starts animating. Could be another open world example. And then here's another one where the eagle had told me to click on one of these objects in order to advance something or change something. One way that not using variables and things like that to make objects available or unavailable is you can click on them to have them disappear from the scene. This one we've used, and you'll see in the code, we've made the transparency 0, so it's still there, but it's gone from the scene. We had set up a conditional on this that says that we need to click on a total of 5 objects to see what happens. So that was sort of a math if conditional. All right, so we clicked on it 5 times, and then that advanced the story. So that's using that sort of gated one where potentially I could have a bunch of things around in the world, and really it only advances the story when I've ensured that the user experienced all of those plot points or saw all of those objects or those locations. Again, intentionally not terribly creative because I just wanted to string together the toolkit of what could be done. Again, in this example, to reiterate, there's the collision where I could be running around in the world and only when I run into an object does something happen. We do a quick example of, this can actually also move the camera, so you can teleport them to a new scene. I just jumped, but we jumped into the proximity. So another one is only when I get close enough to an object will it happen. We keep seeing Loki, but some rough and tumble code. This was the one where I look at Freya, then I look at him, so that's a view. And then this is the example of using clicking on objects as a ability to reveal parts of the world or narrative points or things that would advance your story in an open world example. Well, that sort of wraps it up for today. Again, this one is more to say that since our last design lesson, we've learned a bunch of new Alice skills and programming concepts and ways to approach your code that introduced event programming and introduced conditional programming. You could use all of those new skills to create just a really rich linear animation. They're all very possible things to just expand that first design lesson and make it more interesting and have things that happen or the story pauses and waits for interactions or things like that. But you could also now start to think about how you could design something that is more of a conditional nonlinear, that is a choose your own adventure storyline, or it could be just something where instead of doing something where the camera is controlled and we create a linear animation, how would we break down all of those things that were parts of our story and make them so that the user can go out in the world and experience them themselves and have the agency to be able to choose the order. And then some other things that you can layer onto that to say that you still want to have that ability to move around in the world and reveal the story as you want, but you want them to have been sure to have experienced some elements before other elements and things like that. So I hope you go back and, challenge yourself to another project-based learning, take the skills that you've learned, think about how you might do that pre-production and design using those and what we went over today, and then create a really rich interactive world or a branching choose your own adventure narrative or something along those lines. So thank you all for joining again today. And I look forward to next week. We're sort of down to some of the last lessons. I might circle back and add some other ones that are optional that might expand or help you understand things we've covered up until now. I believe next week we will cover variables. That's sort of the last element before we then return to a game design lesson where using variables allows us to create win and lose conditions and some other more intentional game elements. That's not to say that the things that you haven't learned thus far and even the design that's in here couldn't feel like a game, because the branching narrative can still be some sort of a game where you have different ends. So theoretically there is a win end of the story and a lose end of the story, or things like that, a completion part of an open world. But we will add more intentional game elements to the next one, and then approach it more from a game design. So when you're designing it, thinking less about how does the narrative progress or how do we explore the world, and then what are the intentional decisions for making it a game. So thank you for joining us this week. Again, this is up on YouTube. If you found it there, there should be the other lessons that we've covered in previous weeks. And then join us next week for the next lesson on